Apparently, the young man from Poland feels quite at home in Khanty-Mansiysk, Siberia. Round 4 in the 2019 FIDE Chess World Cup got underway with Jan-Krzysztof Duda facing off against the American Jeffery Xiong. The American, of course, just upset and ousted Anish Giri, one of the headlining games and stories coming out of round 3. But let's see what happened in the first game of round 4 with these two young stars facing off. We had an English and a symmetrical one at that. After the first few moves, Black, of course, has a choice to continue the symmetry or break ranks, so to speak, and fight for the center. Very often, Black chooses the more aggressive approach these days. But after CD, Knight D, Bishop G2, we get the move Knight to C7, normal, because there's potential tension building up here on D5. And after castles G6, we get our first sort of taste of the fact that maybe Jan-Krzysztof came here having cooked up something in the kitchen. I say that because the move played has only been played 3 times. The much more popular traditional approach, the move D3, it's a very natural move, prepares to bring the bishop out to E3. You have this sort of reverse Sicilian pawn structure. Even moves like B3 and A3 have all been played more than the move that Jan-Krzysztof chose here. So despite some of the storylines here by a few that have analyzed this game, that obviously down the road we know there's some critical moments and Jeffery Xiong had his chances, it did feel in hindsight, now having spent a couple hours reviewing this game in detail, that Jan-Krzysztof was really the one setting the tone and pushing his agenda from the start. And to me that all started with the move Knight A4. So what are you doing here with this move that moves a knight twice and breaks principles? First, let's remember, Black has already moved his knight 3 times, right? So if you're looking for justification, at least there's a little bit there. Also, when you start to look at the concrete specifics of what's going on the board, the fact is the C5 pawn is under fire, and there's no easy way to defend it. The only moves that have been played previously in this position was the move B6. Now, after B6, we're going to see that there were some tactics, and a shout out to my boy Santero13 and a throwback to the Renaissance masters of old, in that the most aggressive way for White to take advantage of B6 is actually with the move D4, which is already played as early as 1966 by Pogaevsky versus Taimanov. After the move C takes D4, the point is that Bishop F4 is followed quickly with Knight takes D4, and you see that the 2 open diagonals, these 2 lethal, ruthless bishops over here, really punish Black for this early move B6, exposing an undefended rook. In that game, it eventually ended in a draw here, but it should be noted that Pogaevsky was clearly better here as White against Taimanov. So whether Jan-Krzysztof Duda is aware of these, the great influence of the masters of yesteryear, or whether he's just prepared this with an engine and knew that B6 was no longer good for Black, I don't know. But Jeffery Xiong apparently got the same memo and played the best move, Knight E6. Regardless of that, though, I'm not prepared to say that Jeffery was as well prepared, because after D3, he plays Knight C to D4, a move that not only do the engines frown upon, but just from my chess perspective shows a little bit of lack of understanding of what Black needs in the position, because you're moving yet another knight another time in the opening. Now, full realization, Jeffery's obviously a much stronger player than me, and there is some ideas where the knight will come to D4, eventually to F5, to hit the bishop on E3, where we know it wants to develop naturally and hit C5. But there were other ways to deal with this sort of natural approach coming for White. Namely that a move rook to B8 just feels safer. It threatens to play B5 in some positions to get the knight out, but also just prepares to play B6 in a lot of positions where you no longer have the issues of the rook sitting there being spied by that ninja on G2, right? Making any natural move with the knight to hit the knight on C6 doesn't do much when there's no real tactical tension there, because the rook is no longer on the diagonal. After rook to B8, I actually analyzed knight to G5 would have been possible, but here now if White has wasted yet another move with a knight, now Black can feel justified if he wants to reinforce his knight on E6 and keep the pawn on C5 defended. So spending, as usual, probably a little more time trying to dive into the details and pretend that I'm still a real aspiring professional chess player. That was sort of my assessment of what maybe Black should have done here and what the critical moments were, because after knight C to D4 was played, White's able to develop naturally here, and you really get the picture just on rook C1. Just look at the board. White is up at least 2 moves, if not maybe even 3 moves, right? The king is still in the center. White has developed all the bishops, whereas Black has not, and White already has pressure on the C5 pawn with the rook. So you could argue White is just significantly ahead in terms of what really matters in the first stage of things, getting your pieces out. Castles loses the pawn. Now, yes, there's some potential here to win the pawn back with knight F5. and that's kind of what happened in the game. But after knight takes, bishop takes, if Jan-Krzysztof plays the most accurate move here, I think that Xiong is already in trouble and sort of would, I guess, justify what has been my opinion of the opening preparation and the quality of play by both players to this point. Jan-Krzysztof played the move bishop c5, but I think that bishop to f4, a natural move that immediately prepares white's biggest advantage that you've just gained, which is the 2 center pawns, given that you just won yourself a center pawn here on c5, holding you back no more. This would have been best. Note that if something like bishop takes a2 is played, we have b3 and queen to b6. You can play the move knight b to d2, and at some point, potentially that bishop on a2 may feel a little bit lost. You can also note that bishop takes b2 would be met by the move rook to b1, and after the bishop retreats, something like queen d2 should still give white a slight edge, with ideas of e4 eventually coming in bishop h6, kind of similar to what we see Jan-Krzysztof tried to do in the game. Note that I don't really think rook takes b7 would give white too much after bishop takes a2. Too many pawns being traded and perhaps not enough pressure to follow it. So, after bishop takes e6, though, Jan-Krzysztof played bishop c5. Black wins back the pawn. And after rook b1, bishop g7, we get our first critical moment where I think that despite the preparation that had been pretty high to this point, I think Jan-Krzysztof loses his way a little bit here. You could already argue, as I said, bishop f4 was a little more accurate. But here there was a miscalculation that he actually acknowledged himself in the post-mortem, that not that he didn't intend to sacrifice the exchange. So there was some who maybe misunderstood that white actually had every intention of giving up the rook for the dark square bishop we're going to see in a minute. But it was the order in which it happened that really could have left black with an advantage. Here's what I mean. Rook takes b7 allows queen to c8, which is just a double attack. And you're thinking, okay, how can you justify this? Well, the idea for white was to bring the rook to this nice and temporarily safe square on a5, because bishop c3 was always planned to be met by queen a4. White is saying something very, very simple here. If you take my rook, I'm going to win your bishop. I already have 1 pawn extra for the exchange if we're doing the math, and you have these very, very long-term positional weaknesses over here on the dark squares. It's a practical sacrifice. Maybe the engines don't totally agree with it from that perspective, but it was always intended for white to get pressure in this way. What was miscalculated by Jan-Krzysztof here was that the intermezzo, rook to b8, is really, really key for Jeffery Xiong that he found. Why? Let me show you. The variations that he had hoped for, that being Jan-Krzysztof, would happen after bishop takes a5, queen takes a5, and let's say we get rook b8 again. Now white can play rook c1. The point is you defend the bishop again, and in this variation, you still have the option of playing e4. e4 is the move you really want in a lot of positions, not only because it kicks the knight from this nice square, and therefore makes the dark squares weaker. The knight's no longer there. But often e4 was then going to be followed by d4, and that's where white's long-term compensation is coming in a lot of the variations I looked at. The big issue, and it took me a while to understand this, why was rook b8 changing that? Well, the difference is that rook to b8 in the game prevents rook c1. Why? Because of a nice shot that is not easy to see at first. Bishop to d7, exclam. This move would force the queen to either move to some random square on the board that loses the rook for free, right? We don't want to lose the rook for free. And in this variation, queen a3 is not possible precisely because your rook is on c1. The rook on b8 guards the bishop and would immediately win large amounts of material. So again, what's the point? Rook to b8. The point is this. Jan-Krzysztof had every intention of sacrificing the exchange, and a lot of what we're going to see in the game is what he thought he was going to get. But the move order itself was inaccurate when Jeffery found this very nice intermezzo rook to b8. Also note, of course, you can't play rook takes a6 because the bishop on c5 is still hanging, along with threats like bishop b7. So white would have been really stuck here, and that's why white had to play the move d4 that he never wanted to play. The twist ending of it all, though, is that despite the criticism that Jan-Krzysztof gave himself, said he missed rook b8, after bishop a5, queen a5, Jeffery misses his chance to put the clamps down and actually punish the move order, actually take advantage of why d4 was bad. If you want to pause the video and think a little bit about what I foreshadowed that white wants, think about the position we were talking about before with the rook on c1 and the pawn on d3, and try to anticipate with white wanting the move e4, that's what I was saying is a key point to the compensation, right? Kicking the knight out and really getting the big center, potentially attacking the dark squares as well. What move should black have played here for Jeffery Xiong to save the game? Okay, assuming you pause the video, and hopefully you enjoy those moments. Leave a comment, by the way, if you actually like that I ask a question and want you to engage and use your critical thinking cap, or if that's just you're just not into it. Let me know. I'm actually curious. Regardless of the other efforts trying to be made to make these videos instructive for you all, I'd be curious to know your thoughts. Okay, so in the game, it was not taken advantage of fully, but the move that would have been key and heard around the world is bishop to d5. This move is the move that would have taken advantage of the blunder move order by Jan-Krzysztof. This move just prevents e4. That's really the key, and the bishop on d5 is super irritating for any compensation that white want to get. I looked at variations like rook e1 to try to get e4 the old-fashioned way, right, with some big protection from your tower of power. But after rook b5 with tempi and then knight to d6, I was already looking at a position where you like black so much more than you do in the game. e4 is so much harder to get. If you move the knight, you're allowing more pieces to be exchanged. a2 is still weak and ultimately probably shouldn't have been something Jeffery was rushing to go after. Now, it's very easy for me to say that in hindsight, and again, that's the job, is to analyze these things and know how difficult it is to find those accurate move orders in the game. But it does have some positional, or let's say strategic instructive takeaway, that it would make sense that bishop d5 is the much better move here, because you're taking advantage of something you can only take advantage of temporarily, that white pushed the d-pawn and no longer has e4. So much can be said to prove my analysis as correct as far as why Jeffery should have played that, because after rook b2, Jan-Krzysztof did not give Jeffery a second chance to stop e4 and just rushes for it, giving up the a2 pawn completely worth it so that he can get his big center and potential compensation. After knight to d6, he plays queen a3, allowing the a-pawn to be taken and the queen moves. Again, if just to note, if rook takes a2 had been played first, pretty much the same thing would have happened as the game. Queen c3, knight d6. And while it's possible other moves could be played here for white, knight g5, maybe even rook e1, I think that likely the best move is queen e3, because the whole point is it defends the center and prepares the attack of queen h6 and knight g5. So my point was, I spent some time trying to figure out if there was any more details here. Both myself, Irene, and the engine, we spent a lot of time here. And I don't think it would have mattered whether Jeffery had taken a2 first or played knight d6, because again, the queen's coming back, you're losing the pawn with tempo, and eventually coming to e3. So we'll stick with that story. This position here, again, it's still a little early to say it was the final critical moment for Jeffery to stop what was coming here with all kinds of really aggressive, nasty compensation on the dark squares. But it does seem that he panicked a little bit, but I didn't even give this move in my analysis. Again, you can check out my blogs. I know I'm a little behind on the blog, but that's because there's a lot of analysis here, and then I record the video, and then I don't always have time to get to the blog after other things needed at Chess.com. But there was a part of me as a chess player that couldn't give the move Jeffery played, f6, a full question mark, despite the fact that it's a bad move, because the only way that the line that black probably should have played is justified is by finding a very, very difficult move at the end that is kind of engine-worthy and not something you can really criticize black for fairly, at least for me. That would have started with queen b7. Now, this move's logical. You hit e4, and you're trying to use the queen and knight to coordinate together. Okay, so this makes sense. Things like e5 you'd be really happy about because you can move the knight with tempo on the queen and then play bishop d5 and battery's your uncle over here, right? Not Bob, battery. So this would have been fine, but queen h6 is very, very dangerous. Now all of a sudden knight g5 is coming, right? Well, if you go for this and then play f6, now e5 comes in, and it feels like white's attack is very, very strong, especially in this position when after queen h3, there's actually very direct threats of g4, the bishop is vulnerable, but in this line, there's a key point at the end that only the engine finds. Queen to b2 stops all of it because of a very, very hard-to-stop threat. No matter what white does here, black is actually threatening bishop to c4, just removing the rook and then mating everything on the second rank. This is hard to see, right? Just to point out, if you don't go for something like that, knight g7, just to show that it really is a dangerous threat. Now you take f6, you take, and the knight comes in, h7 is falling, e7 is falling, all kinds of problems. So without knowledge and foresight of this idea, bishop c4, it's very hard to criticize the lack of finding queen b7 when it's a very human thing to do to just play f6 and stop all these shenanigans and play defensive chess. The problem is that after f6, rook c1, queen d7, white switches gears a little bit and takes advantage of f6 in a new way. Now you can pause the video and guess the move for Jan-Krzysztof if you haven't seen the game. Instead of being fully committed to the dark squares, this move order by Xiong, the reason f6 was an inaccurate mistake is because now white switches, plays d5 first and then brings the knight into the center to take advantage of the light squares. So suddenly we have a new problem, right, of the f-pawn wishing it was on f7 to guard e6. So very, very nice heads-up play by Jan-Krzysztof to kind of recognize his opportunity to switch and play for some sort of different positional compensation. I will note, however, that there was a small inaccuracy here because of the last move I'm going to say that Jeffery had to have a defensive chance. White should have played the move knight d4 first. In fact, I'm going to Tarantino this and tell you knight d4 was the best move first, and I'm going to come back in a second and show you why. After queen takes h3, bishop takes, and then knight here, this is the moment where very, very key that black finds the right defensive idea. He starts with rook c8, which is okay. And we get a little bit of tickle here, going back and forth. But after rook to b1, this is the key moment. Let's just say we were here to start because the players gained a little bit of time and time pressure. In this position, black has really one last chance to coordinate and be ready to defend. And that move had to be queen to d7. Bringing the queen back, as much as that is tucking your tail between your legs, you're going to see was necessary because of white's attack just getting so strong. And to point out now, things like knight e6, you can play a5, and the main ideas I wanted to highlight is, as much as this looks very tough for black, this is a very bad, it's hard to look at black and feel thrilled about the position with this knight being so menacing, the queen and the rook. It's very dangerous. But in this move order, it's also suddenly hard to be white too. Why? Well, if you keep playing natural moves like rook b6, trying to hit d6 and take advantage of a6, I showed a variation like a4, rook a6, and you can resign after rook a1 check, king f1, and queen to b5, threatening rook and checkmates over here. This is one example of the fact that it's now dangerous for white for the first time to leave the back rank, which it wasn't in any of the variations in the game, despite the queen being on h3, feeling a little bit more menacing. But actually, this variation would have been better defensively, have the queen on the 7th rank, and it's a little bit harder for white. But because of that idea, defending for black, that's actually why, my Tarantino coming back, that's actually why knight d4 was more accurate first. Why? Well, if you play it this way and they go queen d7, now when you take, and play knight e6, there is no way to deal with rook c7. Why? Because rook c8 loses on the spot. We trade and queen h6, and there's no way to stop mate on either g7 or f8. If you play the queen d7, queen f8, if you move to e8, I'm mating you on g7. This is some advanced stuff. I spent some time with this game, if you can tell, but this was really the key point. That move order would have been more accurate, precisely because, as I'm saying, it would have prevented queen to d7. Probably the best for black, I analyzed, was rook to b8, but now still after takes in here, it's almost like white is up some time because black never had time to kind of fully coordinate. And even things like rook a to b2, queen a7, rook 2 to b7, queen takes a6, and I think white is actually still the one in control. Even rook b1 can be met by queen c4, and once white deals with this threats, things like coming back to the 7th rank are still very hard to stop. So, okay, that's a lot of detail, but that's what was really going on here in these critical moments. Instead, Jan-Krzysztof took d6, as we said. It should have been defended well if black had found the move queen to d7 instead of rook a4. Unfortunately for Jeffery, he misses his last chance really to get that defensive coordination he needed, and here come the troops. Knight to e6 now grabs the 7th rank, and this queen on h3 never has a chance to right the wrong that she did when she left her army behind. Rook to c4, rook to e1 first. This takes away the checks on c1, which means queen a7 is a direct threat. For example, if you play a5 instead of what was happening in the game, white is still better after queen a7, queen h6, and something simple like king g2. You can check out my blog for more analysis, but I think this is very, very difficult for black. The engines say black is still okay, but don't believe it. This is very, very hard for black to hold. No real moves here. If you want more lines to prove, I'll just go a4, h4. You're frozen. You move the rook. Eventually, black is in big trouble after things like queen to d7, and there's just very, very few moves that black can play here without just getting crushed and mated. Note that the whole idea of g5 that was played in the game doesn't work after things like h5, where I just stop the queen from having any good squares to come back and defend, which is why Jeffery played g5 in the game, because his whole idea was to try to have an escape route for the queen to come to the 7th rank, but Jan-Krzysztof takes advantage of that. Boom, e5. You can't move the pawn from f6 without g5 falling, and the wheels are coming off here. Very, very strong tactic, opening up the 7th rank. Queen h6 is played, but after d6, white is just way ahead on the time that matters, right? The d pawn, we got dirty dancing with Donna on the d file here, right? We're going to have a baby girl. That's how babies are made right there. So again, there was no other choice. You had to take with the D pawn, because if you take with the F pawn, we have this. And again, now the point is you get your queen H6, you get your idea of wiggling the queen, but it's just too slow. So hopefully the variations I gave, you can maybe watch this video twice if you really want to see those critical moments, kind of explain why black was in so much trouble, why he needed to play queen D7 earlier. But again, after D6, rook C1, takes, the king does find safety, and it's just a matter of time. Too many threats here on the 8th rank and with the D pawn. G4, your last-ditch effort to try to mate me on H3, runs into H4. Nothing like allowing en passant, hiding in front of your enemy pawn, and laughing in the face of danger. Queen G6, Queen A8 check, and black simply resigns here. The game is over, the king comes up, and white is getting more than enough. I actually didn't even spend enough time on this one, but maybe even just D7. Honestly, there's enough moves here where white is going to get way too much material and be crushing. In fact, I think D7 is the move, because now you can't go for F2 because Queen E8, mate is threatened, and if you take here, I get a second lady on the board. Or even Queen E8 if I want to do it that way, to force the queens off and have a second lady easily winning. So that's just my human chess brain calculating that I think D7 would be enough to be lights out. So Jeffery Xiong resigns after Queen A8. And that's our story, Morning Glory. Now, obviously, there were a lot of decisive games in the first set of round 4 in Conti Mon 6. So watch out for a second video either coming your way today or even this weekend as I break down the critical moments of the other 3 decisive games in one video. So that's a video you're not going to want to miss. Thanks for tuning in. Give me a like, give me a subscribe, give me a share, tell people where it's at over here, watch these videos, and I will see you around on Chess.com.